Okay, we have our guide sheet instructions if you remember when we opened up our pattern. And this is the sheet that we're going to look at now. And it has a couple of diagrams and a couple of practice sheets on here. And this is going to really help you get comfortable in sewing your machine. So the first sheet that I have up here is for a beginner pattern. And the beginner pattern is assuming that you need to learn some of your sewing machine parts. We're also going to talk about threading your sewing machine. And we have practice sheets for pivot lines and straight lines. The first one that we're going to look at is the sewing machine parts. What you might want to do before you get fully started is you can take a pair of scissors and we can cut on our cutting lines. You can see we have our scissors here and cut these apart. Alright, so let's get to learn about our sewing machine parts. I have here the sewing machine that we're going to be using, and every sewing machine is a little different. So I'm going to remind you guys throughout this process that some of these things might not match up when you're looking at my machine and comparing it to your machine. So if they're not the same, our recommendation is to go online. You can look up your sewing machine's model, or if you have the manual, to reference your manual as well so that you can make sure that you are fully understanding how your sewing machine works. However, most machines have the same parts and the same functions. So we'll talk through what we have here, and you'll be able to find out any other details if you need to in your manual or online. We're going to come on over here. We have an electric machine. Our machine needs to be plugged in, that means. And there's a plug on the side, and it's going to hook to electricity. The other thing that it's hooked to is our foot pedal. The foot pedal is like the gas of the sewing machine, so when we push it, it's going to make the needle go. So you can see, I turn the light on, and most of the time the light should come on. However, don't assume that the light bulb can burn out, and that means your machine can work. But what's going to happen is when I push the foot pedal with my hand, it's going to go. Most of the time you guys will be pushing the foot pedal with your foot, but for today's purposes so you can see everything working together, I wanted to show it to you by using my hand. I'm going to go ahead and turn my machine off because I don't want to accidentally hit my foot pedal and hurt anybody. So once we have our machine plugged in, we want to think about how our threading process is going to go. Up here I have a spool pin, and that's where the spool of thread will go ahead and slide right on here, and we'll talk about that for any beginner patterns on how to thread the sewing machine. Some spool pins might sit in different directions. Ours happens to kind of look like it's lying down or it's horizontal. And this little cap here, I'll show you. You put the thread on, and this cap will hold the thread in place, so it's not going to go anywhere. From there, we come over to our threading process. So we first would think about winding a bobbin. So we have a bobbin winding pin right here. That's for the tension, and that's going to hold our thread in place. Here's our bobbin winder over here, and when I push it to the left, it's going to engage the winder. So if I turn this on, watch what happens. The winder is now going to spin. And there's a very specific process in how we need to thread for winding a bobbin, and we'll do that when we thread our sewing machine. Alright, so I'm going to take my thread off, put that back on. So now we're going to come on over to the front of our sewing machine. In this section you can see there's a couple of knobs or dials. Some machines might have buttons if you're digital. Again, every machine's a little different, so you are going to have to look at your manual or go online and look up the model of your machine to see how these function if you're not sure. So the first knob that we have over here is our stitch length, and that's going to be how short or how long our stitches are going to be. So you would just turn it. If you want a really long stitch, you're going to be closer to the number 4. If you want a short stitch, you're going to be closer to that number 1. This other knob is going to be our stitch selector. This matches up to the menu over here for what types of stitches you want to use. So if you want to use a straight stitch with the needle in the center, we would use letter A. So that means I would have to turn my knob to letter A. And there you go. So it's on the letter A. Over here, you are going to find our tension wheel. And this will turn up or down and tell us how tight or how loose our tension will need to be. So for most machines, you want to leave it on the factory setting unless you're using some really thick fabric or maybe some really thin fabric. But for our purposes, we're going to leave it on the number 4 for our factory settings. The next piece that we're going to come over to is our take up lever. And I always think of it as like a little bunny that hops up and down. So if you turn the hand wheel over here, There goes the bunny, and that pulls the thread up and down in the machine, all the way down to the needle, and kind of keeps it flowing through so that when we're stitching, it keeps moving. Okay? So let's come on down to the bottom of our machine here. First thing we have is our presser foot lever. It's just like a little lever in the back that goes up and down. You can see it's moving this piece right here. Presser feet can look a little different. Every machine might have a different size or different function. So this is our standard presser foot. It looks kind of like skis to me, and what it will do is it will press the fabric to the sewing machine or the needle plate here. So you can see when it's down. You really always want to have that presser foot down when you start sewing. Your machine will often make some terrible noises when it's left up and make knots. We also have our needle here in the sewing machine. The needle is what holds the thread in place, and that sharp point is obviously very important to go into the fabric and make sure that it can make our nice smooth stitches. So the little bottom part of our needle is the eye of the needle. Most hand sewing needles, you'll notice the eye is at the top. So you'll know that a machine sewing needle, the eye is towards the bottom sharp point of the needle. Over here, I'm going to lift up our presser foot. We have the needle plate. And the needle plate has a couple of different things going on. You'll notice some numbers. These numbers are like a ruler, so they're measurements to help us find our seam allowance, which we will talk about when we get into sewing our pattern. If you come over to this little latch on this side, I'm going to pull it away. Every machine might be a little different in where that latch is. I'm going to pull off this little plate here. This is what holds our bobbin in place. So we have a top loading bobbin. Some machines you might find the bobbins are underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back in right there. And I'm going to pull away this the storage compartment, which has an opening, which you can kind of have some tools in there or some extra thread, whatever might fit and whatever you might need. And some machines will have a bobbin that will load from this underneath section of the sewing machine. What I'll also mention is we now have this arm of the sewing machine that opens up, and it's great for sewing things like cuffs or around the hems of a pant leg. So things in like a circular sort of motion will go around the arm of the sewing machine. So it's good to know how to open that up. So I'm going to put the storage compartment back on. There it goes. And then we're going to come on over here. We have our reverse stitch or our backstitch button. Again, some machines, they might be in a different spot. Ours we push down, and that will allow our machine to reverse stitch. And you'll just let go and it'll stop reverse stitching. And then over here we have our hand wheel. And our hand wheel is what we need to do to turn our needle manually. That means without the electricity. So if the needle's stuck down in the needle plate and we need to get it back up, we're going to go ahead and turn that hand wheel. And generally you're going to want to turn it away from you. So that's a clockwise motion, but there are reasons you might need to turn it towards you. It can go either way, depending on what you need to do. Okay, now I think we're ready to go ahead and thread our sewing machine. Okay, the next sheet we're going to take a look at is our diagram on threading your sewing machine, which is in the beginner patterns. And I have my sheet here, and it gives really a simplified, stepped out process on how the thread works its way around the sewing machine. Now we're going to actually put this into action over here on our sewing machine, because really, if you're not threading your machine correctly, 9 times out of 10 when something's not working right, it has something to do with your threading. So really getting that down, practicing it often, looking at your manual, it's going to be really important to be successful in using your sewing machine. You can see over here, I already have red thread set up. I'm going to be using red thread throughout most of my sewing machine videos just because you can see it better than some other colors. So you'll notice that sometimes it doesn't always match up to the fabrics that we're using. So I just want you guys to understand that most likely you're going to be using thread that's going to be closer to the fabrics that you picked out for the patterns that you're going to be using. So I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to pull it off the spool, and we're going to wind our bobbin first. And like I said, every bobbin's going to wind a little different. Our bobbin, we're going to come under here to our first section here. It says number 1. And then my machine has a diagram that shows me exactly how I need to step out the winding process. So my 1 is going to bring me over to the tension wheel. The tension wheel, kind of hear that little click in place, we'll squeeze the thread in place to make sure when it's winding off the spool, everything's going to be nice and tight. The other piece I need to wind my bobbin is, of course, this little spool, and this is my bobbin. This little spool has a little hole at the top. I like to put my thread from the middle of my bobbin out through the top of my bobbin to help attach it when we begin to wind. So I'm going to bring my bobbin over to the bobbin winder. I'm going to hold my thread out through that hole, and then I'm going to push it to the right to engage the bobbin winder. Next thing I need to do is make sure my machine is on. I can see my light bulb is on. I'm going to step on the foot pedal. So let's go ahead and wind up this bobbin. Once I establish a bit of the winding, I'm going to just detach that extra piece that we had to begin with, and now we're ready to continue. Okay, you probably saw that the machine started to slow down and really pretty much stop. And what's cool about these machines, most machines have a little guide and it will tell us how much needs to be wound onto our bobbin so it doesn't overflow and make a mess. So our bobbin is now filled up. I'm going to pull it back to the left. That's going to disengage the winder. I'm going to pull it off the winder. And I'm going to grab my scissors and cut the thread away from our spool. So now they are two separate spools. We have our bobbin and our big spool of thread. And our bobbin is now all nicely wound up. One thing I always like to check for, to see if it's squishy. Sometimes if you don't have your bobbin properly set up, the thread will not wind on there properly, and when you squeeze it, you'll feel that it's actually pretty soft, and that will be a problem when you're sewing. So you want to make sure that you're not able to squish it in too much and that it won't need to be rewound. So ours is feeling pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and bring it down to the bottom of our sewing machine here. This is where our bobbin lives. I always think of the bobbin lives in the basement of the sewing machine. Ours happens to be like a top-loading bobbin. Some bobbins might be underneath your sewing machine. So again, we're going to just remind you to go ahead and take a look at your manual or online if your machine is different in any way to make sure you are doing this properly. Our goal is just to give you the concept of making sure you are threading the machine in the right way. Okay, I like to make sure my thread is in the correct position. So my thread is hanging off to the left-hand side of the bobbin, this way. I like to think of it as the letter P. If your thread is hanging off the right-hand side, looking like the number 9, you want to flip it around and make sure it's going in this direction. Now that I have my thread going in the right direction of my bobbin, I'm going to drop it in place. I have a little arrow here. Not every machine is going to have this arrow, but it's telling me it wants the thread to go back to the left side. So I'm going to hold my bobbin in place. I'm going to take my thread and pull it right between that little slit right there. I think you guys can hear that little like twing. And it's captured the thread and it's holding it in place, which is good news for us. Now we're going to leave our bobbin down there and we're going to come to the top of the sewing machine and begin to thread the upper part of our machine. Back up here at the top of our sewing machine, I still have my spool of thread on the spool pin. I'm going to pull a little bit of the thread off. Make sure it's not connected to any of the winding pieces, so just pull it out if it is. I'm going to bring my thread back over to that number 1 first flap where we started with our bobbin winding, and it's going to go, I have a little hook on the back, it's going to go under there. My number 1 is now telling me I need to find number 2. Number 2 is going to bring me all the way down here, and 2 is going to tell me to go back up to the top. However, I need to figure out how I can hook it for number 3. So what I need to do is come over to the hand wheel. I'm going to turn it, bring it up. There, I always think of it as like a little bunny hopping up and down. There he is. We're going to stay on the right hand side. I'm going to hold my spool of thread in place so it doesn't continuously pull. So it's going to keep my thread in place up there. And I'm going to go right to left, and it's going to go into the little eye of the bunny up here and hold it in place. So once we have it hooked into number 3, we're going to bring it down through that little middle opening to number 4. And number 4 is telling me to now bring it down towards the needle. There's a little hook back here. The hook is important, just again to keep everything nice and aligned. So it's going to keep things straight. And I'm going to get ready to thread the eye of my needle. What I like to do is I like to cut my thread on a little bit of an angle. It gets rid of the fuzzy frayed ends of it, but also makes a little sharp edge when it's on an angle like that. And now for the fun part, everyone's favorite, putting the end of the thread through the little tiny hole of the eye of the needle. So I'm going to hold my thread pretty close to the end. So you don't want it too far away or else it's too flimsy. Bring it a little close. And just gently, I like to line my eye up with the eye of the needle. It gives me a good line of vision. And push it through that hole. So I've grabbed it on the other side. I'm going to hold my thread out straight in front of me to make sure when I pull it, it doesn't get twisted around the needle. And there it goes. So everything is nice and in place. Now what we want to do is connect the upper thread to the bobbin. And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to lift up the presser foot back here. I'm going to come on over to my hand wheel. I'm going to turn it towards me. And keep going, keep going, keep going. And you're going to notice the thread's going to start to come around from the top, and it's going to hook my bobbin thread. And I'm going to slowly keep turning that hand wheel and pulling my top thread at the same time. And it's going to bring the bobbin thread up. So you can see that little loop that has pulled up from the bottom. And I'm going to pull that loop out until we have 2 strands of thread. I call it marrying the threads. They've come together. And we're going to take the 2 strands of thread and we're going to tuck it underneath the presser foot out the back of the sewing machine so that they're all going to go in the same direction. And make sure that thread touches the table so that when we're sewing, when the needle pulls, the thread won't come out. So this makes sure it's just long enough for when we want to get ready to sew. And the last thing, we're going to put our little bobbin cap on, lock it in place, and we're ready to sew. As a best practice, after you've threaded your sewing machine, I always like to take a scrap piece of fabric and run it through just to make sure the machine is threaded properly and the stitches look good. So I'm going to take this piece of fabric, put it underneath the presser foot, put the presser foot down. I'm going to turn my hand wheel, make sure the needle is in the fabric, and we're going to go ahead and just run a seam quickly down the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to come forward, turn the electricity on, and come forward, do a back stitch. When we get to the end, I'm going to take a look at how the machine sewed. It didn't sound funny. Sometimes you'll hear clunking or it just won't sound like its normal self, and that means you definitely want to stop. But everything looks nice and straight and pretty smooth.